Sir. The next session will be Dr. D.S. Raju Memorial Award session. I invite Dr. G. Gopalakrishnan and Dr. Y. Arul Prakash to chair the session. Welcome to the dais, sir. Dr. G. Gopalakrishnan, Chief Psychiatrist, Somansia Hospital, MB Recognized Psychiatric Institute, retired professor and HOD of MVG College, Bangalore. Significant contribution to rehabilitation in psychiatry through Gunaseelam Dava project. 45 years of service in psychiatry. I welcome you, sir. Dr. Y. Arul Prakash, President, IPS Tamil Nadu Chapter 2020, Professor and HOD of Kanyakumari Medical College. I welcome you to the dais, sir.
Good morning, friends. So this is an important session of DS Raju Memorial Award. It is a very prestigious one for the postgraduate students of different institutions. Thanks for all of you being here. We have 5 presentations to make. I hope all the 5 were available. There are 3 offline and 2 online. So we are going to take the first offline presentation. Can I have the first speaker? Dr. Diyuthi.
So before the presentation, this is really a very important session. It will be very nice to have the PG award papers presented, evaluation and the thing. So first contestant, offline, Dr. Diyuthi R.
Good morning all. My study is 3-month clinical outcomes in individuals with anxiety disorders presenting to a tertiary care center during the COVID-19 pandemic. Moving on to introduction, the worldwide prevalence of anxiety is about 2.5 to 7%, and studies have shown that in India it's about 3.1 to 5.8%, and the recent COVID pandemic have increased the prevalence by about 20%. So moving on to rationale, to the best of my knowledge, outcome studies in individuals with anxiety presenting to hospital settings have not been published from India. So ours is a hospital setting based study, so the individuals will be moderately or severely. Objectives, the primary objective is to determine the clinical outcome of anxiety disorders using HAM-A, CGIS, CGIC at 3 months follow-up, to estimate the proportion of individuals showing remission of anxiety after 3 months, that is HAM-A less than 8, and to determine the predictors of good clinical outcome, that is remission. Ours is a prospective observational study, and the inclusion criteria, those fulfilling the ICD-10 criteria of 40 to 48 of anxiety disorders and of more than 18 years of age and who have given informed consent, and we have excluded out individuals with comorbid mental illness. So consecutive patients with onset of anxiety since 1st March 2020, presenting from 1st July 2020 was included in our study. Study variables are HAM-A, CJS and CGIC at 3 months follow-up, and proportion of individuals showing remission of anxiety symptoms, that is HAM-A less than 8. Socio-demographic COVID-related variables at intake, HAM-A and CGIS at intake, and treatment variables. Methods of collection of data. We calculated a sample size of 24 from studies which have used HAM-A, that is Hughes et al. Study, and this was the equation which I have used, and tools for assessment. A semi-structured performer was used, which was pre-tested and translated for socio-demographic, clinical and COVID variables. Hamilton Anxiety Rating Scale, which is used widely for clinical and study purpose, and experts have categorized it into mild, moderate and severe, and it has been used in many studies with good reliability and validity. Next is a Clinical Global Impression Severity Scale, which is an observer rated scale of 7-point scale, and the Clinical Global Impression Improvement or Change Scale, which shows a change in the individual from the baseline. Procedure of the study, those who fulfill the inclusion criteria were enrolled into the study, and informed consent was taken, and semi-structured performer HAME and CGI scales was instituted either by a third-year resident or an assistant professor, and individualized management was provided, and all were reassessed after 3 months using the semi-structured performer, HAME, CGIS and CGIC, either during routine OP visit, or if not feasible, within 2 days we have contacted them via telephone, and after getting telephonic consent and for recording the study. Statistical analysis. The primary statistical analysis was descriptive statistics, and for the clinical outcome, which is our primary objective, HAME and CGI score change, pair students t-test was used. For determinants of outcome, students t-test and chi-square test was used, and with a level of significance of p less than 0.05. Institutional ethics committee ethics clearance was obtained, and information sheet was provided, and informed written consent was sought. Privacy and confidentiality was ensured throughout the study. Moving on to results and discussion. 58.3 individuals were female, and 83.3 could read and write, and 70.8 were married. And they were diagnosed of having generalized anxiety disorder or adjustment disorder anxious type for about 37.5% of each, and rest were diagnosed of having panic disorder, hypochondriasis or OCD, and functional level was impaired in majority, that is 95.8, and suicidal ideation was present only in 2, that is 8.3%. Treatment variables, pharmacotherapy was given for 95.8%, and either SSRI or SSRI plus benzodiazepine or NASA along with SSRI or antipsychotics. Formal psychotherapy was extended to 70.8%. COVID pandemic related variables, social activity and interaction was affected in 58.3%, and work in 79.1%, financial status in 54.2%, and regular healthcare visit in 41.6%. Variables related to anxiety at intake, we found that younger age, that is 41.5 years, was associated with severe anxiety at intake, and there are no other studies which replicate similar results, and no other variables were significantly associated with anxiety intake. Clinical outcome of anxiety disorders at 3 months. There were remarkable change in the mean scores of HAME and CGIS at 3 months. That is, HAME changed from 27.75 to 7.75 with a standard deviation of 4.98, and CGIS from 5.5 to 2.54, and in CGIC, 83.3% have shown much improvement at 3 months follow-up. This is a graphical representation, that is at intake, all were either having severe or moderate depression, and at 3 months, 62.5% had complete remission, and rest were having only mild anxiety with a t-value of 12.52, p less than 0.01. And clinical CGIS changed, mean score had changed from 5.5 to 2.54. That is, at 3 months on CGIS, only 3 individuals had moderate to severe illness compared to all individuals having moderate to severe illness at intake. T-value of 15.18. And in CGIC, 20, that is 83.3, had shown much improvement in their illness. So there are no pre-existing literature to compare the outcome in our study, as no published studies on anxiety outcomes with onset during COVID pandemic was there. And the improvement, that is, in our study, it was 62.5%, maybe due to the direct effect of therapeutic measures, or due to coping mechanism, or the abating of first wave of COVID in the latter part of 2020. And short-term outcome studies done by Crisell et al. And Lennox et al. Have found that the remission rates ranges between 50 and 27% for anxiety disorders. And moving on to determinants of outcome at 3 months, severe anxiety at intake predicted persistence of symptoms at 3 months. This replicated the results of studies done by Slabbier et al., Steen, DJ, and Scolling et al. And female determined having significant higher anxiety scores compared to men, and persistence of anxiety at 3 months. Studies by Hansu et al. Have shown the higher prevalence of anxiety in women, but there are no literature showing persistence of symptoms of anxiety. And patients with suicidality had higher HAME scores outcome. However, we only had two individuals with suicidality, so significance was not tested. Moving on to strengths and limitation. Strengths, our study included moderately or severely ill patients, and standardized instruments were used, and ours was a follow-up study. Limitation, power calculation was not done for determinants of outcome, and investigators were part of the investigation team, and our study could not be generalizable. Moving on to conclusion, individuals with anxiety who presented to hospital setting during COVID pandemic had moderate to severe symptoms of anxiety, and younger individuals have severe symptoms with dysfunction. And short-term outcomes showed marked improvement following intervention, but about 1/3 had persistent symptoms. Women and those with severe symptoms had persistence of symptoms, and this study sheds light on the phenomenon of anxiety during a prolonged pandemic and may assist in formulating intervention plans. These are few of the references which I have used. Thank you.
Good presentation. You told moderate and severely ill patients. What was the criteria for choosing?
Actually, ours was a hospital setting based study. So, at the intake, all were either scored using HAM-A. In that, we got score of moderate and severely ill. Since it is a hospital setting, mild anxiety patients usually never reports to us, and that is what my study showed.
Moderate and severe anxiety patients, isn't it? Not COVID.
Anxiety ill patients.
Okay. So questions from audience. Yes.
In your study, you have found that 1/3 of patients had a persistence of problem.
Yes, sir.
Did you manage to find any determinants for that, or is that?
Actually, sir, my primary aim was only show the outcome, that is change in HAM-A. So, and since power calculation was not done for any determinants, and our sample size was so small, that is 24, which is significantly enough for showing the significant changes in the HAM-A. So we couldn't find any determinants for persistence of symptoms in 1/3. However, they have remitted, like there was improvement in them. That is, at the time of presentation, they were either moderately or severely ill, and at 3 months, either they were having mild anxiety.
Dr. Shagul.
In your limitations, you did not mention the absence of a control group. If you feel, I didn't finish. If you feel that if there was a control group that did not receive any treatment, whether that would have any implications on your findings?
Actually, sir, we haven't included any control group since the sample which we have used is severely and moderately ill. So it will be unethical if we are not giving any treatment for them. I thought like that.
Did you follow up this patient? You said 2 patients had suicidal ideation. How much of depressive symptoms did they have? Did you calculate? Did you ever try to find out was it a primary depression that you're dealing with?
Actually, the 2 people who had suicidal ideality were diagnosed of having panic disorder, but at 3 months they had shown remission, and we haven't done any find any determinants.
You diagnosed anxiety, but at the end of 3 months you found them suicidal.
No,
At the end of 3 months,
no,
right?
sir. At the beginning, they were having suicidal ideations.
At the beginning, at the start. So did you rule out that it was not depression that you're dealing with?
Sir, couldn't get?
No, did you not rule out that it was depression that you're dealing with, not a GAD?
Actually, we have included those who have only anxiety, and we have omitted if they are having any other comorbid mental illness along with them, because. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
Next contestant will be Dr. Shruti Agnihotri.
Can I start? Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Shruti. I am a junior resident from IMH Hyderabad.
So my study title is Study of Adverse Childhood Experiences and Psychopathology of Imprisoned Sexual Offenders at a Central Prison in Hyderabad, Telangana. My co-authors are Anita ma'am and Dr. Umashankar sir. Coming to the introduction, the sexual offenses are defined as sexual contact with another person or touching of another person with one's sexual organs without consent. And there are different types of sexual offenses like sexual assault, forcible rape, sodomy, fornication, female genital mutilation, obligatory inspection for virginity, forced prostitution, trafficking for sexual exploitation. All these sexual offenses are dealt under the sections 354, 375, 376 and 377 of Indian Penal Code, whereas there's a separate act, POCSO Act, which deals with sexual offenses against children. According to the data given by NCRB, there were 77 rapes happened per day in the year 2020. Coming to the etiology of sexual offending, there are different theories like biological theories, personality theory, and one important theory here is trauma theory, which suggests that adverse childhood experiences could be one of the most common thing which is found in sexual offenders. And these adverse childhood experiences are broadly classified into three categories, that is abuse, neglect, and violence. And apart from these adverse experiences, psychiatric disorders itself can be a cause for such offenses. However, all these theories are very elusive, and therefore the prevention is more challenging here. Coming to the aims and objectives, the aim was to study adverse childhood experiences and psychopathology of imprisoned sexual offenders. The objectives to assess adverse childhood experiences, evaluate psychopathology, and to document crime details. Coming to review of literature, there are a number of foreign studies done which says that early traumatic experiences are very commonly found in the lives of sexual offenders, and one study that is done by Ravis et al. Says that sexual offenders were 3 times more likely to have been sexually abused than non-sex offenders. However, there are no Indian studies done to assess adverse childhood experiences of sexual offenders. Hence, we conducted this study. So, material and methodology, we conducted this study at a central prison in Hyderabad, Telangana, and we got a sample size of 48. It was a cross-sectional study conducted over a period of 2 months, males between the age group of 18 to 65 years under section 354, 375, 376, 377, IPC and POCSO Act were included, and those were UT and CT prisoners, and they have given their informed consent were included in the study. Those participants with severe physical illness, those who were not cooperative and with other offenses were excluded. The study tools are semi-structured intake pro forma and adverse childhood experiences international questionnaire to measure childhood adversities, and it can be translated into the appropriate language, and a mini interview was done for psychiatric disorders. Coming to the methodology, 48 sexual offenders were included in the study, and then written informed consent was taken, followed by which semi-structured intake pro forma was applied to gather socio-demographic data, crime details, and past criminal history. And a mini interview was done, followed by adverse childhood experiences international questionnaire. Coming to the results of the study, so here's a table which shows the socio-demographic variables, and in the study we found the mean age was 37.7 with a standard deviation of 14.8, and then we found that there were a large number of participants who were uneducated, that is 31.3%, and the other ones that is 41.7% had dropped out from the school, and the main reason was lack of interest, that is found in 22.9% of the participants. Coming to the other variables like occupation, there were a large number of participants who were unemployed, that is 16.7, and a large number of participants, that is 72.9%, were belonging to a low socioeconomic status. Coming to crime details, there were 75% of the convicted participants, and then IPC 376 was the most common section, that is 72.9%, as seen in the pie chart here in the green color, and the next common act was POCSO Act, which was involved in 58.3% of the participants. Here are some of the other crime details, like 75% were convicted, 72% were under 376 section, and the most common type of crime was rape, that is 81.3%. Coming to the victim details. So the minimum age of the victim was 3 years. We found victims of both genders, and there were different kind of relationship with the victims, and the most common was unknown. Here's a pie chart which is showing the relationship with the victim. As we can see in the blue, the most common type was unknown. Here's a chart which is showing adverse childhood experiences, international questionnaire details. That is like the most common adversities experienced were community violence here, and then emotional neglect, physical neglect, and 18.8% also experienced sexual abuse. Here's a table which is showing the same data. So the total score for adverse childhood experiences was measured, and the maximum score was 13, and the minimum score was 4. Coming to the psychiatric disorders, from our study, we found that 35.4% of the participants were currently depressed and 25% were suicidal. Followed by this, the alcohol use disorders was found in 45.8% of the individuals, and ASPD was found in 54.2% of the participants. So we have done Pearson correlation test for variables like total adverse childhood experiences score and number of offenses committed and number of incarcerations. And we got a statistically significant relationship between number of offenses and total adverse childhood experiences score with a p-value of 0.02. And similarly, the p-value for number of incarcerations and total adverse childhood experiences score was 0.04. So here's a graph which is showing that the total adverse childhood experiences score, as the score was increasing, the mean number of offenses were also increasing. So here's a table which is showing the history of contact sexual abuse in the childhood, and nine of them had history of sexual abuse in the childhood, and all of them were now under the legal charges of 376. Coming to the discussion, in the current study, the majority of the population was uneducated, and some of the others were have discontinued the studies because of lack of interest, and this was supported by other studies as well. And many offenders have found to have very low level of education. Coming to next thing, that is poverty and low socioeconomic status. This can lead to witnessing violence, victimization, and later turning into an offender. This was found in many other studies, and here also in our study we had a large majority, that is 72% were belonging to low socioeconomic status. And majority of them were, as seen, they had a legal charges again under section 376 and POCSO. This could be because children are easy targets for sexual offenses due to lack of understanding about the act, or maybe the offender is very closely related to the child. And according to an international study, the prevalence of child sexual abuse is growing sharply. And as we can see, the numbers have been increased. In the study, we found that the minimum age was 3 years, and the most unanticipated finding what we got is the 2 victims were males. So we can assume that sexual offenders know no age or gender. And we found that the most common relationship was unknown, and however the next most common relationship with the victim was that a girlfriend, and it was very staggering to see that the victims could be daughters or nieces, and majority of the participants had experienced adverse experiences in their childhood, and the most common one was community violence in the form of physical fights or threatening. And this finding is in line with other studies which also suggested that presence of adverse childhood experiences in sexual offenders. And certain participants has also experienced sexual abuse in the form of fondling or anal intercourse, and sexual abuse in childhood could lead to a lot of physical and mental problems to a person. It can be observed that victims in childhood were now the perpetrators, and this is also supported by other studies. And in the lockdown, it was found that there was a rise in the childhood abuse cases as reported by a helpline, a national helpline, where 30% of the cases reported sexual abuse, And in most of them, 90%, the perpetrators were a close relative or a family member. The most common personality disorder which we found was antisocial personality, and they had no remorse for the act, and they were blaming the victim for provoking them and for the current condition. This was supported by other studies as well. And however, the presence of schizoid, schizotypal, and avoidant personality disorders was also found in other studies. Common psychiatric disorders found were major depressive episode and alcohol use disorder, as found in 45%, and majority of them had committed the crime under the influence of alcohol. The alcohol consumption by the perpetrators increases the likelihood of sexual assault by multiple pathways, and we found a statistical significant relationship between total adverse childhood experiences score and the number of offenses committed. Therefore, more the adversities, more are the number of crimes. To conclude with, the experiencing adversities in childhood could lead to a lot of adulthood problems, could lead to aggression, criminality, and with the increasing sexual offenses in the country, it is needed to identify such experiences in the offenders and to help them deal with it in a better way. And not only identifying it in the offenders, to protect the children from such experiences could reduce the risk of mental health problems. The limitations are small sample size, female participants not available. I would like to give my acknowledgements to the Superintendent and Medical Officer of Central Prison for giving us the permission. These are my references. Thank you.
Okay, good study. In your study, you told that in one of the tables, 52% had ASPD, isn't it? Okay. So if I say that only because of ASPD they committed such sexual offenses and not because of childhood trauma, how will you justify your stand?
So like I said, the majority of them had experienced such adversities in their childhood in various different forms. And such.
Whether it is because of because 52% of the people have ASPD traits, and only because of ASPD, if I argue, and not childhood trauma alone, how come you will support your study and
Sir, experiencing such adversities in childhood could itself lead to some of the psychiatric problems as well, like developing antisocial personality. So I think because of the adversities, they must have developed this personality, and which ultimately led into this sexual offense.
In your conclusion, you said that these childhood adverse experiences could lead to this kind of crimes in the future. Actually, considering your design, a cross-sectional design, considering your analysis, you did mostly a correlation. So based on this, can we make such an etiological attribution? It could be leading to this. Or is it just an association?
Just an association.
But in the conclusion, it was presented otherwise.
One question is, like you mentioned that title means mentions sexual offenders.
Yes.
But it seems only 72% prisoners are convicted. Remaining are under trials.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So how can you actually label an under trial as an offender? So that is not technically correct, I think. Till they are
Yes.
convicted of their crimes, they cannot be qualified as offenders, at least legally.
Yes, yes.
Number two, you mentioned that the relationship is not known in the majority with the victim.
Sorry, I didn't get it.
The relationship with the victim
Yeah,
is
yes.
unknown. What does it mean? Unknown means?
Unknown means like they don't know who the victim was. Like someone someone passing by the road, or late night they found a girl. One of the
Yeah, that
like
matters
that.
they're
That
not
is
related.
unknown. So?
That simply means they're not related.
Okay.
So,
Yes,
so
yes.
unknown doesn't make any sense. Either related or not related.
Okay, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
last question?
It's a very interesting study and a brave study, because you have been to a very risky population and studied this wonderful.
Thank you, sir.
one question is, like you found a relationship between childhood traumatic sexual experiences and later on similar offenses,
Yes.
being a sexual offender. Have you found any correlation between the sexual offense, sexual trauma, and the similar kind of offenses towards the children? For example, have you found any
Yes,
relationship?
sir. Those, in my first study, I found that 9 of the participants were having history of sexual abuse, and all of them were involved under the section 376, but not under the POCSO Act. So,
Okay, ma. Thank you. Okay, fine.
Thank
Good
you.
study. Next presentation will be Dr. Varsha Vishwanathan.
Good morning to everyone present here today and the members of the dais. This is an explorative study to assess whether social cognition influences insight during the remitted phase of bipolar disorder. Clinical insight is a multidimensional construct that comprises of awareness of symptoms, need for treatment, and potential consequences of the disorder. Impaired insight, as we all know, leads to poor adherence to medications and poor functional outcome. Clinical insight was also found to be more impaired in mania than in depression. Earlier, insight was defined as the ability to imbibe knowledge about the illness alone, whereas currently it also includes the ability to comprehend that one's views about mental illness experience is different from others. In this juncture, social cognition, which is the ability that allows people to grasp others' mental states and meanings of social interaction, seems to play a vital role. And this comprises of theory of mind, social perception, attributional style, and emotion recognition. In bipolar patients, emotion recognition was the only social cognition domain to have a positive, yet a small association with insight. The other 3 social cognition domains have not yet been explored. Hence, the aim of this study is to examine for any significant association among social cognition and clinical insight in remitted bipolar patients, and to examine the predictive roles of the domains of social cognition on clinical insight. This was an observational cross-sectional study following clearance that was obtained from the Institute of Human Ethics Committee, and a 2-day workshop for applying the social cognition rating tools in Indian setting that was conducted by NIMHANS online was attended by the assessor. Application of this tool required 1.5 hours for each patient. It included subjects aged 18 to 60 years of both gender who were able to understand and read Tamil or English and were diagnosed to have bipolar affective disorder, currently in remission for the past 1 month. It excluded subjects with dementia, neurological illness, and mental retardation, those who had received ECT in the last 6 months, those suffering with severe visual or hearing impairment, substance abuse, or dependence. Hence, 48 euthymic bipolar patients were recruited, following which socio-demographic and illness variables were collected using a structured proforma. The Young Mania Rating Scale and the Hamilton Depression Rating Scales were scored, and severity of illness was scored using the Clinical Global Impression Scale for bipolar patients. Finally, social cognition was assessed using the Socrates tool, and clinical insight was assessed using the Mood Disorder Insight Scale. Coming to the tools in detail, the social cognition rating tools in Indian setting assessed 3 domains of social cognition, namely theory of mind, which involves one's ability to identify beliefs of others. This comprises of first order, which involves one person's belief, second order involving a person's belief of another individual, and the 4-part recognition test, where an embarrassing remark in a social situation must be identified by the subject. The second, social perception, which is the ability to judge social cues and non-social facts. Through Socrates, 4 high emotion intensity videos, for example, the emotion anger, and 4 low emotion intensity videos, for example, embarrassment, were showed to the subjects and they were asked to identify them. Finally, attributional style, which is how one explains the causes, positive and negative outcomes. For example, if one were to slip and fall, he could either attribute it to himself slipping over a peel of banana, which is known as externalizing bias, or a push of another person, known as personalizing bias, or a puddle of water, known as situational bias. Finally, insight was assessed using the mood disorder insight scale, and this comprised of 3 domains, which is awareness of disorder, attribution of symptoms, and need for treatment. This was a validated tool as well. Hence, correlation between variables and clinical insight was evaluated using the Pearson's correlation, and predictors of insight were assessed using multivariate linear regression models. Bootstrap analysis was done to reduce bias, and the data was analyzed using SPSS 21, where p-value of less than 0.05 was considered significant. Coming to the results, the socio-demographic characteristics of the study population were as follows. Majority of them had a mean age of 36.81, belonging to the male gender, completed high school education, working in the agriculture sector, belonging to the lower middle socioeconomic status, and most of them were found to be married. In illness characteristics, they had a mean of 4.8 total number of episodes, with a mean duration of illness of 11.3 years. The YMRS and HTRS scores depicted that they were in remission, and the severity of illness scores of 1.2 depict that they had minimal severity. In the domains of social cognition, the first being theory of mind, the subjects had more deficits in the second order theory of mind, that is, beliefs of one person of another individual, with a score of 0.78. In attributional bias, subjects were found to have more externalizing bias, that is, tendency to attribute negative outcomes to themselves, with a score of 4.98. And finally, social perception, they had more deficits in social perception in low intensity videos or vignettes. For example, as I mentioned earlier, emotions such as embarrassment, with a score of 0.82. In insight, the global insight scores of 12.03 out of a total of 20 were found in the study population. In comparing bipolar patients with and without a lifetime history of psychotic symptoms, no significant differences were found in socio-demographic, illness characteristics, social cognition, and insight amongst the two groups. In assessing the correlation among illness variables, social cognition, and insight, duration of illness was found to have a significant positive correlation up to a moderate degree with global insight and need for treatment. The inference is that longer the duration of illness, better was the insight for need for treatment. Similarly, externalizing bias was found to have a significant positive correlation for global insight, and social perception in low intensity vignettes were found to have a significant positive correlation up to a moderate degree to awareness of disorder and need for treatment. The inference is that higher the deficits in social perception in low intensity emotion videos, poor was the insight, or the insight for need for treatment was found to be more poor. Coming to predictors of insight. As I mentioned, linear regression models were performed, and the first model, that was attribution of symptoms, did not have any significant results, hence it is not being displayed. Coming to the second model, which is awareness of disorder, 33% of the variance of awareness of disorder was predicted by second order theory of mind, externalizing bias, and social perception in low intensity vignettes, with social perception in low intensity vignettes being the most significant predictor with a p-value of 0.004. 15% of variance of need for treatment was predicted by externalizing bias and social perception in low intensity vignettes, with the latter being more significant with a p-value of 0.007. And finally, 30% of the variance of global insight was significantly predicted by externalizing bias alone with a p-value of 0.002. Coming to the discussion. The first predictor I mentioned was social perception in low intensity vignettes. This is the difficulty in identifying social cues of low intensity predicted, and this predicted poor awareness about disorder and poor awareness about the need for treatment. This can be explained by the hypothesis that impaired ability to identify subtle social cues which contradict their beliefs about their mental state, results in a poor awareness that they are ill. Externalizing bias, which is the tendency to blame themselves for negative events rather than the illness, predicted poor awareness about the disorder, poor awareness about need for treatment, and poor global insight. This can be explained by the hypothesis that externalizing bias blocks the ability to perceive and trust the view of others that treatment is needed. Hence, replication studies with imaging to understand the neurobiological link between impaired social cognition and impaired insight in bipolar patients would be helpful, and our study findings will help in understanding the multidimensional construct of insight and help in designing interventions to improve insight using social cognition in bipolar patients. This is currently underway through several therapies in patients of schizophrenia. The limitations of this study include role of emotion recognition, that is the fourth domain of social cognition, was not assessed. Potential predictors of insight like stigmatizing attitudes, neurocognition, and cognitive biases were not considered, and the findings are preliminary because of a small sample size. The strengths include the tools that were used were culturally adapted and validated in the Indian context. The assessor was trained for administration and scoring of the tool, and it is a first of its kind study, to our knowledge, to assess the role of social cognition domains on clinical insight in remitted bipolar patients. Hence, in conclusion, deficits in social perception and attenuated attributional bias were found to predict insight in remitted bipolar patients. Hence, this study highlights the need for incorporating social cognitive interventions for insight facilitation in bipolar patients. Thank you. And these were my references.
It's open for discussion. If questions, quick questions, comments. Any guess about social cognition, since you have now done only with BPAD patients, right? Can you guess about what could be the difference between social cognition in schizophrenia patients and BPDA patients that would affect the outcome and the determinants of outcome? Before, if somebody could ask a question.
The research group in our institution actually had also assessed social cognition among patients of schizophrenia earlier, and that is underway in its publishing stage right now. But comparison, and that study included comparison between schizophrenia patients and control group. But there's no, we haven't worked on comparing two groups, that is schizophrenia and BPAD yet.
The problem is social cognition was done mainly on schizophrenia.
Yes,
if
sir.
you see the international literature, mostly on that. You're doing it on BPAD. So my guess is you would have done the research study, no, about what happens for social cognition, how it is important, even the Niemann studies. Now you try to guess, and then that guess from whatever available literature to your study. I just want you to comment on that. The distinct differences or the distinct togetherness in terms of this assessment for both, social cognition for both disorders.
Definitely, the assessment of social cognition in bipolar patients were found to have deficits as well, sir, but not as significant as amongst patients with schizophrenia.
So that needs a special emphasis, no?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yes, please. Go ahead.
In your title, you called it an explorative study. What do you mean by that?
So it was a cross-sectional study to explore whether it had an influence, that is social cognition, influenced insight in bipolar patients.
Okay. In one table, there was a comparison between people who had a history of psychotic symptoms versus who did not have. What was the relevance of that?
So, pardon, sir?
And in one table, there was one comparison, those who had the psychotic symptoms in their episodes versus those who did not have.
Yes, sir. So it was comparing lifetime history of psychotic symptoms amongst the two.
Now, what is the
groups.
relevance of that analysis?
Psychotics, the presence of lifetime history of psychotic symptoms in review of literature is found to have a significant role on social cognition. So we took that into consideration, but in our study, we did not find any significant result.
So based on your findings, what all specific interventions you suggest, like we are all practitioners, to our bipolar disorder patients in remission? Specifically, what we should do with them?
what we're aiming at is, so as we all know, sir, in bipolar patients, compliance to medication and insight for need for treatment is the reason their relapse occurs.
No, to tackle this social cognition deficit, to tackle these deficits in social cognition, what specific interventions, whatever is practically feasible in low resource settings, what we can do for that?
So that is the future direction that we're aiming at, sir, but we haven't
Okay,
made
thank you.
any yet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The mean number of episodes was something around 4.3 or something. Did the number of episodes have any correlation with the social cognition? The more the number of episodes, what will be the social cognition? Did you explore on that angle?
So we did explore on the illness characteristics as well, sir. In our study, we did not find any significant correlation between the number of episodes and social cognition. But history or review literature does say that as the number of episodes are more, social cognition is more impaired. But in our study, we did not find significant correlation.
And in the inter-episodic period, what was the level of social cognition? Almost normal or a little retarded, or what was the level of social cognition in between the episodes?
So this was a cross-sectional study, sir, so we did not do it prospectively or longitudinally.
Any more questions? Okay. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, sir.
Good study.
So we are going to the organizers, since one more paper is added, is the time going to be the same for each? Is the time going to be the same since you have increased the number of papers to 6? Originally your time had same time? Okay. So now may I request now Dr. Varsha Sri Peramburi. Perambudri. It's an online, if she is available online. Yes, please.
Yes, sir.
Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Varsha Sri Parambudur, Junior Resident in Department of Psychiatry, Gandhi Medical College. The study, my study title is Burnout and Resilience Among Resident Doctors Working at a COVID-19 Nodal Center in India. Introduction. COVID-19 pandemic has created a massive healthcare demand, and health workers are working tirelessly to keep up with it. This has led to negative psychological effects on health workers and their families. One such effect is burnout, which is increasingly being recognized as a concern. Burnout is chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. It has 3 characteristics: feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased negativism towards one's job, reduced professional efficacy. Resilience is the ability to bounce back from adversities and to be able to cope with stress in a highly adaptive manner. Aim. The aim of the study was to know the prevalence of burnout and its relation to resilience among resident doctors working at a COVID-19 nodal center. Objectives: to know the prevalence of burnout in resident doctors, to know the levels of resilience among them, to assess the association of burnout with various levels of resilience. Methodology. Before the initiation of the study, the Institute's ethics committee permission was sought, and then a permission was applied to the administration for obtaining the contacts of the residents. And this questionnaire was emailed to all the residents to the IDs. And a checklist for web-based surveys, Cherries, was used to plan this study. The participation in the study was voluntary, and the number of responses were restricted to 1 per participant to avoid duplication of the data. It was an online anonymous study with cross-sectional design conducted over a period of 10 days. And all the resident doctors, postgraduates and interns posted in the hospital were included in this. A total sample size of 267 was obtained. The question had 3 parts. The first part was about the socio-demographic data. The second part was Copenhagen burnout inventory to assess for burnout. The third part was a brief resilience coping scale to assess resilience. The questionnaire also included a consent form, and it took about 10 minutes for them to complete. The tools used. The socio-demographic data included questions related to age, gender, education, occupation, number of working hours, whether place of work, whether it was non-ICU or ICU work, past and family history of psychiatric illnesses, willingness to seek mental health help. The Copenhagen burnout inventory was used to assess for the burnout. It had 19 items with 3 subscales: personal burnout, work-related burnout, and client-related burnout. They included 19 questions, and these questions were measuring in both frequency. Few of them were related to frequency, a few of them were related to intensity of the symptom. This is the score interpretation of Copenhagen burnout inventory. A score of equal to or more than 350 was taken as presence of work-related burnout. A score of equal to or more than 300 was taken as presence of personal burnout and client-related burnout. Brief resilience coping scale. It is a 4-item standardized validated instrument to assess for resilience. It had high internal consistency and good retest reliability, and it was applied in medical students, nursing students, and doctors in the previous studies. Based on the categories, this is a scoring of the brief resilience coping scale, and they were categorized into low resilient corpus, medium resilient corpus, and high resilient corpus. Data analysis. The data that was obtained was entered into an Excel sheet and was exported to the SPSS. SPSS statistical software version 22.0 was used for the data analysis. The p-value was considered significant below 0.05. All the tests were two-tailed. The scores of burnout and resilience followed a non-normal distribution, and these values were represented as medians with interquartile ranges. The non-parametric tests like Mann-Whitney U test and Kruskal values were applied to compare burnout among 2 or more groups. To correlate between the scores of burnout and resilience, Spearman's rho was used. To assess for the strength of association, binomial logistic regression was used and odds ratio were presented. Results. Most of the respondents in the study were females, unmarried, living with family, and were involved in direct care of the patients with COVID-19. Majority of them were ICU workers, were working in the ICU and were working for longer hours, more than 48 hours per week. 4.5% had past history of mental illness, and 7.1% had family history of mental illness. Among the respondents, majority of them were medium resilient corpus at 47.2%, followed by low resilient and high resilient corpus. The prevalence of personal burnout was 53.6%. It was the highest, followed by work-related burnout at 46.4% and client-related burnout at 40.8%. And these are the scores of burnout and resilience represented as medians with interquartile ranges. Females and those with past history of mental illness had significantly higher scores of personal burnout when compared to males, postgraduate trainees, and those without a past history of mental illness, respectively. Those who mainly worked in ICU and had longer working hours per week showed significantly higher burnout rates on all 3 subscales of CBI. Those with past history of mental illness had significantly higher work-related burnout. The distribution of burnout varied across the 3 categories of this resilience, with low resilient corpus showing highest burnout rate, followed by medium resilient corpus and high resilient corpus. All the 3 domains of burnout showed a significant negative correlation with the scores of resilience. Regression was done to see for the association for the absence of presence of burnout in 3 subscales with categories of resilience. The burnout was taken as present or absence of burnout, and the resilience was divided, dichotomized into 2, with low resilient corpus in one and medium and high resilient corpus in the other. And this is the odds ratio. The low resilient corpus had significantly higher odds or likelihood of having burnout in all the 3 subscales when compared to medium and high resilient corpus. Discussion. In March 2020, a tertiary healthcare center located in Secunderabad, it was designated as the sole COVID center for the state of Telangana. There was a rapid rise in cases in excess of the resources that were available at the single hospital. Here, there was an unprecedented situation among the frontline workers, which chose to assess burnout among the resident doctors as they were more likely to be involved in the direct care of the patients. There were studies done during previous pandemics reported high distress levels in medical workers when compared to non-medical health workers, and especially these levels were high in doctors and nursing staff. A global survey of health workers from 60 countries reported 51% burnout during the COVID-19 pandemic. In an Indian survey, the prevalence of personal burnout, work-related burnout, and pandemic-related burnout were 44.6%, 26.9%, and more than 50% respectively. The prevalence of personal burnout was highest, followed by work and client-related burnout in our study. The increasing work demands during the pandemic, with possible increasing emotional demands and demands on home, might have led to a skewed work-life balance and led to an increased burnout. The clients, that is the patients-related burnout in our study, was higher when compared to those during the pre-COVID-19 era. It may be due to the gradual increase in the number of COVID-19 cases, with them requiring hospitalization. Working in emergencies and critical care were found to be significantly associated with burnout in all three subscales in our study. This is in line with the previous studies where they reported highest levels of burnout among those healthcare workers working in the emergencies. Longer working hours were significantly associated with this burnout. Longer working hours led to greater stress and exhaustion with poorer perception of learning environment and active avoidance coping. Females were found to have higher burnout than males in the study. Similar to previous studies, have showed that have attributed it to their dual role in the society and multiple responsibilities both at home and work. Interns were found to have higher burnout than the postgraduate trainees. Previous studies have showed that those with lesser experience find it difficult to navigate the demands of their profession and contribute to increased perception of burnout. Past history of mental illness was significantly associated with presence of personal and work burnout in our study. Those with psychiatric illness have higher chance of developing subsequent episodes and further deterioration. In our study, resilience was inversely associated with burnout. Resilience can suggesting a protective role in the burnout, suggesting a protective role of resilience in the burnout. And the burnout was not just present in the low resilient corpus, it was also present in the high resilient corpus, implying that there might be other factors that are affecting the burnout, and the additional solutions may be required to address the issues related to all the three domains of burnout. Strengths of the studies. Prior to the initiation of the study, we could not find any Indian studies which examined the relation between burnout and resilience during the COVID-19 pandemic. It included resident doctors who are more likely to be working closely with the patients of COVID-19. It adds to literature on burnout in low-resource settings like India. It creates an awareness about the burnout and the need to address it. There is a clear discrimination of three domains of into personal, client-related, and work-related. A checklist for web-based surveys was used to plan this study to improve the quality. Limitations. It was a single-center study. Its findings may not be generalized to the other areas. It is a cross-sectional study. Therefore, the temporality of association could not be established. No control group was used, and convenience sampling was used. No longitudinal follow-up was done. It was an online anonymous study which may result in self-reporting bias. Conclusion. A considerable proportion of the respondents in this study reported burnout, and client-reported burnout has increased when compared to the pre-COVID area. Pre-COVID times, burnout was inversely associated with resilience, suggesting a role of resilience as a protective factor. Burnout was present even in high resilient corpus, suggesting there might be other factors also affecting this. Then the importance of burnout is burnout leads to a decrease in professional efficacy and increase the avoidable medical errors. Assessment of this one and planning of this might help us to combat future burnout and help in future pandemic preparedness and decrease the avoidable medical errors. These are my references. Thank you.
Okay, study. You mentioned about one variable, that is long working hours, isn't it? The major cause for burnout. Was there any other variable influencing the burnout? Say more number of deaths or more critical patients, more number of patients, like that. Did any other variable influence the burnout?
Thank you for your question, sir. In this study, we have taken three subscales of the burnout, sir: personal burnout, work-related burnout, and client-related burnout. when it came to personal burnout, there was a role for gender also, sir, along with this. And it was not just longer working hours, that is more than 48 hours per week, but also those people who are working in the ICUs. Then we took two groups, sir, ICUs and non-ICU workers. Those who worked in ICUs showed higher rates of burnout on all three subscales, sir. Personal burnout, work-related burnout, and client-related burnout, all three of them, sir.
Any other questions?
This online questionnaire was forwarded to how many people in total?
It was forwarded to around 620 residents, sir.
Okay, so the acceptance rate was very low. It was less than 50%, I think. No? Around 273 people only responded.
It was 267, sir. We have calculated the sample size using Z square P into 1 minus P by margin of M.
Organizers. So there is some network issue with the presenter. We'll move on to the next candidate, Dr. Madhavi Bhatt.
Good morning, everyone. The title of my study is Study of Clinical Profile and Stressors in Patients Presenting with Dissociative Disorder to a Tertiary Care Teaching Hospital. Myself, Dr. Madhavi Bhatt, Junior Resident from Enapoya Medical College, Mangalore. And my guide is Dr. Anil Kakunje, sir. Dissociative disorder is a condition characterized by disruption of the normal continuity and integration of consciousness, memory, identity, motor functioning, and behavior. Usually, there is an association between the stressors and the presenting complaint. Assessing these factors helps for a better understanding of patient's problem. Hence, there is a need for a detailed study which helps in a better management. Aims of the study were to determine the role of various psychosocial factors that influence the dissociative episodes. We also looked at the clinical profile and to find the relation between the type and levels of dissociation with levels of stress in the study population. The study was done over a period of 1 year after Institutional Ethics Committee clearance. Using the formula mentioned, the total sample size was calculated to be 38, but we included a total of 50 patients in our study. Patients of all ages, both inpatients and outpatients who were diagnosed to have dissociative disorder according to ICD-10 criteria were included in the study. Patients with subnormal intelligence and psychotic illnesses were excluded from the study. Brief dissociative experiences scale was used to assess for the severity of dissociative symptoms and presumptive stressful life event scale to assess stressors in patients with dissociative disorder. An appropriate statistical test such as chi-square test was used. As shown in figure 1, dissociative disorder was found to be more common among females and among patients aged less than 30 years in our study. Figure 2 shows that dissociative convulsion was found to be the most common type of clinical presentation, followed by dissociative motor disorder, dissociative stupor, mixed dissociative disorder, transient position disorder, and dissociative amnesia. As depicted in figure 3, dissociative motor disorder was mostly seen in older individuals, but transient possession disorder and dissociative amnesia were exclusively seen in younger population. Figure 4 shows that in both the genders, dissociative convulsions was found to be the most common type of dissociative disorder. As shown in figure 5, 36% patients experienced moderate and another 36% had severe dissociative symptoms. Figure 6 shows that the clinical assessment of patient stress. Majority of the patients had family conflicts as their predominant stressor, followed by financial problems. As explained in Table 1, financial problems were found to be the predominant stressor among males and family conflicts were found to be the predominant stressor among females. Table 2 describes that family conflict is a predominant stressor among subjects less than 30 years of age, whereas financial problems were predominant among subjects aged more than 30 years. Figure 7 shows that perceived stress scale scores were found to be moderate in majority of the cases of both the genders. We also found that majority of the patients below 30 years were suffering from moderate stress, while most of the patients above 30 years had severe stress levels as shown in figure 8. Among 23 patients who had family conflicts as their predominant stressor, majority of them experienced mild dissociative symptoms. Those who faced financial problems, majority of them experienced severe dissociative symptoms. Majority of the patients who presented with dissociative convulsions had family conflicts as their predominant stressor, whereas patients with dissociative motor disorder faced more financial problems. We analyzed the presenting complaints of individual patients in our study sample with the perceived stress as per clinical assessments. As you all can note in this table, a female patient had presented with complaints of forgetfulness to events that occurred after marriage. Patient developed this symptom after she was asked to go to her husband's family house where she was verbally abused. A 45-year-old male patient was completely mute after receiving a phone call from financial lenders to repay the loan taken. Similarly, all 50 patients were analyzed and all these cases points towards a connection between presenting symptom and the stressor experienced. Coming to the discussion, including the current study, many previous studies have shown that dissociative disorders are common among females. Several explanations have been proposed for this, including culturally acceptable modes of expressing distress, increased rates of sexual abuse, higher rates of comorbid depression and anxiety that have a female predominance. Theka et al. Found that in their study, 52.5% of cases had role models. In our study, we found that 14% of cases had family history of dissociative disorder, which significantly affected their modeling behavior. Reddy et al. Found that the most common presentation of dissociation was dissociative stupor, while Turkey et al. And Dideka et al. Noted pseudo-seizures as the most common presentation. In our study too, dissociative convulsions in 60% of the total sample was the commonest. We found that dissociative convulsion is the most common type of presentation in both the genders. However, dissociative stupor, transient possession disorder, and dissociative amnesia were found only in females. Using brief dissociative experiences scale, we found that 36% of our dissociation patients had moderate dissociative experience, while another 36% had severe dissociative experience. We could not find any study looking at this observation in dissociative disorder cases. Theka et al. Found that 40% of their cases had family-related problems, which acted as the most common stressor causing dissociative episodes. Our study too found that 46% of cases had family conflict, which acted as an immediate stressor in precipitating dissociative episodes. We found that both males and females had dissociation with moderate stress. Similarly, when we looked into the age of the subjects, we found that majority of the patients below 30 years of age had only moderate stress, while cases above 30 years of age had severe stress. We were unable to find any study looking at these factors. Strengths of our study are that it had a good sample size, both genders included with all types of dissociation. It included both inpatients and outpatients, including the children. The present study looked at the stressors of individual patients and has analyzed the association between clinical presentation of the patient and the stress. Limitation are its cross-sectional nature and study done in a hospital setting. To conclude, this study showed the common stressors faced in our culture, the difference in both genders and age groups. It demonstrated the level of dissociation and corresponding level of stress in various types of dissociation. It explains the connection between the possible stress and the presenting symptom. The study of psychopathology in individual cases may yield higher evidence and insight into the problem. So, further follow-up studies can be done to look into the psychodynamic factors of this illness in depth. These are my references. Thank you.
Any questions? Yes, please.
What was the rationale for categorizing age into two using 30 as a cutoff?
Sir, you are not audible, sir. Sorry, sir.
What was the rationale for dividing age into two categories using 30 as a cutoff?
Sir, the average age was found to be around 27. So, most commonly, the previous studies have shown that it is common in younger age. So, that was the basis we divided into younger age as less than 30 and more than 30 years of age.
Any other? Yes, please.
Okay. So the diagnosis of some of the patients is under scrutiny because one patient you told that the particular patient, male patient, was unable to speak after getting the call from the lender. So
Yes,
how will you
yes,
differentiate the dissociative disorder from the factitious disorder or malingering? This is applicable not only in particular case, but also all other cases.
Sir, we included the patients with dissociative disorder according to ICD-10 criteria, sir. So after diagnosing as dissociative disorder according to ICD-10 criteria,
Doctor, please. I am asking a question whether you differentiated from factitious disorder and malingering.
Yes, sir. After
In what way you differentiated,
ruling out the other diagnosis and concluding that it is a dissociative disorder, then the patients were taken into the study, sir.
How did you rule that out? They are not other disorders. Just
Yes,
give me a
sir.
few points in favor or against.
How did I rule out the factitious and malingering?
Yes.
Sir, usually in malingering, there would be external motive or external gain, sir. So, the patients, mainly the stressor was taken and those who are diagnosed as dissociative disorder were intaken, sir.
In this case, doctor, for example, that money lending case, that motive was very clear, that is external. So please look to your diagnosis. Okay, verify the diagnosis before putting in the patient into a particular disorder, then going to the thing. The first step itself is problematic in your case. Thank you.
So you should understand the question more. It can be either malingering or dissociative disorder, okay? So how did you differentiate in between malingering and what are all the points in favor of dissociation? That's what he asked for.
Understood, sir.
Can you tell the answer?
Sir, it was meeting there was a correlation between the stressor and the dissociative symptoms which are presented. There was clear temporal association between the stressor and the presenting symptom which was present in the patient. That's why the
in malingering also there will be a temporal relationship. The clinical points in favor of dissociation, in simple words, what were the clinical presentation points? It's purely a clinical diagnosis, and on what clinical points you concluded that it was dissociation?
The previous, the previous history, before the onset of the symptoms, it was The correlation was there, sir, because the previous history and this was corresponding. The correlation was present, sir. That's why he has concluded as a dissociation.
But are you satisfied only with the correlation as a criteria? Because you know that there was a precipitating event or a factor and you were able to have a temporal relationship between the two. So does that conclude that it is only dissociative? That you cannot rule out the other parameters?
According to the family history as well, sir, the history given by the family members and also the clinical tests which were done, like the cough, reflex, everything, the diagnosis of dissociation was made, sir.
Okay. Okay. Any other? Otherwise, one last question, otherwise we are going to stop at that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, now we'll take the last paper which is included from Dr. Sindhuja. Is she here or it's going to be online? Dr. Sindhuja. Online, okay. Please go ahead, Dr. Sindhuja.
Yes, sir.
Please go ahead with your presentation.
Yes, sir.
Your time starts now.
First of all, I would thank for giving me this opportunity. Today I'm going to present the paper titled Prevalence of Preoperative Anxiety in Patients Posted for Surgical Procedures and its relation to the doses of anesthetic drugs. It is a hospital-based cross-sectional study. I have done this study under the guidance of my head of the department, Professor and HOD, Dr. Murthy sir, and our assistant professor, Gautam Reddy sir. Coming to the introduction, anxiety is described as an unpleasant state of tension or uneasiness that may arise due to many reasons, for example, hospitalization, anesthesia, surgery. A study reported an incidence of about 60 to 80% of preoperative anxiety in adults. The assessment of anxiety is important because patients with higher levels of anxiety show different response to the effects of anesthetic drugs compared to those who are non-anxious. It causes emotional, physical, and psychological problems in the individual. Studies have shown that preoperative anxiety is associated with increase in the doses of anesthetic agents during preoperative and intraoperative period. However, there is currently still a lack of research on preoperative anxiety in patients posted for surgical procedures and its relation to the doses of anesthetic drugs. Many studies did not use validated scales to measure and predict anxiety. Hence, this study was aimed to estimate the preoperative anxiety and its relation to the doses of anesthetic drugs. A validated scale, which is Amsterdam Preoperative Anxiety and Information Scale, is used to assess preoperative anxiety. Coming to materials and methods, this is a cross-sectional study including a sample size of 100 patients undergoing surgical procedures in Shantiram Medical College and General Hospital, Nandyal, Andhra Pradesh. And the study period is between January 2021 to April 2021. And the participants were consecutively selected from the surgical departments. And this is a formula for measuring the sample size. And these are different domains which are used in the formula to come to the sample population. And coming to the inclusion criteria, patients who have given written informed consent and patients who are posted for surgical procedures are included in the study. And those who did not complete the questionnaire or refused to take part in the study, and patients who were already diagnosed to have anxiety disorders and who were on treatment with anxiety reducing agents were excluded from the study. The study was approved by Institutional Ethics Committee. And the instruments which are used here are the self-report questionnaire, which was applied to collect data on socio-demographic variables. And preoperative anxiety was assessed by Amsterdam Preoperative Anxiety Information Scale. Data was collected after explaining the objectives of the study and assuring about the confidentiality. Patients were also explained about written informed consent. Patients who agreed for the above terms and conditions were asked to fill out the questionnaire, and data was collected 1 day before the surgery, and details of anesthetic drugs used and their doses were collected during the intraoperative period. And coming to statistical analysis, the data collected were keyed into Excel for Windows, and statistical analysis was carried out using the SPSS software. Descriptive analysis with measurements of frequency was used to express socio-demographic variables. Association between different variables was tested using the chi-square test, and the p-value of less than 0.05% was considered to be statistically significant. Coming to the results, table 1 shows the socio-demographic variables where majority, that is 40% of patients are between the age 40 to 60 years, with 60% being the male patients and 40% being the female patients. And most of the patients, that is about 57%, had primary school education. And coming to table 2, it shows clinical variables like ASA physical status, history of previous surgery, anesthesia, and preoperative sleeping period. So majority, that is 61% of the patients belong to ASA grade 2, and 10% had previous history of exposure to surgery and anesthesia, and 90% had no history of previous surgery. And majority, that is 37% of patients had a preoperative sleeping period ranging from 5 to 6 hours. And other clinical variables are awareness about surgical procedure, which was present in 48% of the patients, and 25% of the patients used anxiolytics 1 day before the surgery. On API score, 21% had anxiety related to anesthesia and surgical procedure, and 79% patients had no preoperative anxiety. 48% required higher doses of anesthetic drugs during the intraoperative period. And table 3, it shows association between preoperative anxiety and intraoperative increase in the dose of anesthetic agents. 21 patients had preoperative anxiety, out of which 76 patients required increased doses of induction agents. However, among 79 patients who had no preoperative anxiety, only 40% of the patients were given higher doses of the anesthetic agents. And the association was found to be significant with a p-value of 0.004. And coming to table 4, it shows association between preoperative anxiety and preoperative sleeping period. And among the patients with preoperative anxiety, majority, that is 52% of patients, slept for 3 to 4 hours, whereas among the patients who had no preoperative anxiety, 77% slept for more than 5 hours, and this association was not found to be significant. Coming to table 5, it shows association between preoperative anxiety and awareness about the surgical procedure. Among 48 patients who were aware of the surgical procedure, 29% had preoperative anxiety. Among 52 patients who were not aware of the surgical procedure, only 13% had preoperative anxiety. And this association was found to be significant with a p-value of 0.05. Coming to discussion, the goal of our study was to assess preoperative anxiety and its relation to the increase in intraoperative doses of anesthetic agents. Among the patients with preoperative anxiety, majority, that is 76% of patients, needed increase in doses of intraoperative anesthetic agents. In the current study, the association between preoperative anxiety and intraoperative increase in the dose of anesthetic agents was found to be significant. The findings in the current study were consistent with the findings in the following studies. In a study by H.K. Kill et al., patients with higher levels of anxiety required greater amounts of propofol administration during intraoperative period. Williams et al. Suggested that highly anxious patients require a greater amount of sodium thiopental to induce anesthesia. Goldman et al. Assessed anxiety in 53 women presenting for gynecological surgery who underwent the induction of general anesthesia using alfentanil and methotrexate. Another study reported that preoperative anxiety seems to correlate with the amount of methotrexate required. This study also showed a significant association between preoperative anxiety and preoperative sleeping period. In the previous studies, preoperative sleeping period was not assessed, which is a novel element in the study. In our study, the association between preoperative anxiety and awareness about surgical procedure is found to be significant, which is consistent with the results from the previous studies done by Mathais et al. Coming to the conclusion, increase in intraoperative doses of anesthetic agents was required in significant number of patients with preoperative anxiety. As the preoperative sleeping period increases, preoperative anxiety decreased. Therefore, patients need to be assessed regularly for anxiety during pre-anesthetic checkup, and appropriate methods to reduce anxiety should be introduced. Preoperative anxiety can be reduced by educating the patients on factors affecting the anxiety. The strengths of my study are, we have used a validated API scale which was used to assess preoperative anxiety, and this is one of the few studies which assess the association between preoperative anxiety and its relation to the intraoperative increase in doses of anesthetic drugs. And this study has also observed the influence of preoperative sleeping period on preoperative anxiety. Coming to the limitations, it is a cross-sectional study, hence it cannot tell the causal relationship, and sample size is small, because of which the results cannot be generalized, and there is an unequal distribution of study subjects among the referring departments, and the number of patients who refused to participate in the study were not recorded, and consecutive sampling method is followed, which can have selection bias. And I convey my sincere thanks to Dr. Nellie Moorman for giving me the permission to use API scale. and these are my references, and these are my annexures.
Okay, doctor.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And I have two questions. One is pre-operative. The whole study is about surgery. Did you differentiate between any emergency surgery and elective surgery, or were they all elective surgeries? One question. Next is...
Sir,
okay, you answer.
all are elective surgeries, sir. Already admitted patients, one day before the surgery, I have applied the scale, and during pre-anesthetic checkup, and during the intraoperative period also.
But you have not mentioned whether it is elective or emergency. And about awareness about surgery, we all get concerned, we all tell the patient about the surgery that's going to happen, and everything will be informed to the patient. It's their right to be informed. So what do you mean by unawareness of surgery?
Sir, some
You put a
people
table
who are
saying-
uneducated,
Even uneducated, they will be told that some surgery is going to happen to them. So
Yes, sir.
unawareness about surgery, what do you mean? Only mentally
educating the
retarded people can be unaware of what is going to happen, or without any insight. So how do you justify unawareness?
unawareness is whether the patient knows about the so educating the patient about the outcome, whether it is a minor or major surgery, depending on that.
Share that information with the patient. No, ethics will tell you that you have to tell what is that you're going to undergo and how long it's going to take for him to get better. What is the complication one would expect, all that. So that is a presumption. But if you are saying that they are not aware of, and that is negatively correlated with anxiety, then the problem is either it's an ethical compromise. Do you agree with that?
No, sir.
No?
Understandability of the patient, though they are aware, some may be able to understand.
So that means the surgeon is unable to convince them as to what is, the way that the person wants it to be known. Pre-operative counseling, or he said pre-anesthetic counseling, and how much of anxiety was there even before the surgery about the complications of the surgery. What was the problem with that?
Awareness related to both surgery and anesthesia, sir.
Okay. Last question, please.
This Amsterdam scale, is it validated for the Indian population?
Sir, I have taken the permission from the author.
No, validated for the Indian population. That is the question.
Is it standardized for Indian population?
No.
No, sir.
Okay. How was the sleep? Is the time up?
Yeah.
Okay, then fine.
Okay. No, go ahead, please.
How did you assess the sleep period?
Sleeping period, I didn't choose any scale, but I just asked how many hours I have divided on my own. I have given coding according to my own, and I have divided those hours, and according to that, I have taken that variable, sir.
Okay, one more important question. So actually, did you measure other factors that could have led to intraoperative increase in the anesthetic dose?
Yes, like many factors can influence the increase in the dose, like BMI, other factors.
So did you measure them? Did you control for their effects, kind of things in your study? Whatever increase in the dose, whatever increase in the dose that happened, you are attributing that to the anxiety. But there can be a lot of other factors, complications during the surgery, as you said, BMI, a lot of other things can also influence. So those factors were not taken into consideration, it seems.
Even factors like drug abuse. Okay, doctor. Okay, we'll wind up the session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now I welcome Dr. Somshekhar Bijol to deliver the mementos to our honorable chairpersons. Thank you, sir.